just my pleasure to welcome you to the third and final installment. It's just my pleasure to welcome you to the third and final installment. John Buchanan and John Dozman, Old Testament Pastor Emeritus, John Buchanan for a treat. John Dozman, Old Testament. I think I'll just pray us in. We're in for a treat. I'm sure we will be. And I think I'll just pray us in. Are so thankful for the gift of congregational singing. We just brought joy to our hearts. So just accept congregational singing. It just brought joy to our hearts. Just accept our praise.
Morning, everybody. This is a kind of banner Sunday. Wasn't that music, the two Bach toccatas infused? Oh my gosh, that just was transporting. And the singing of Mighty Fortress, and also, this is a banner day for me. I need to tell you about it. I decided today to make a really bold and brave decision. I decided not to put a necktie on. And I think it's the first time, I was reflecting, I don't think I've ever on Sunday morning stepped into the house of God without a tie on. So I hope God's grace is sufficient. Anyhow, it's a remarkable story. A modest shepherd boy becomes king. Along the way, David, youngest son of Jesse, will become so skilled in being a musician, playing the lyre, that the current king, Saul, summons him to come play the lyre to soothe Saul when he's having one of his really, really bad days. Israel seems to be perennially at war with the Philistines, who Professor Dozman taught us are a very dangerous enemy because they have iron weapons against which Israel's bronze is not very efficient. Never knew that before, so thank you, Professor. David's older brothers are in Saul's army, and one day when David is bringing food from home, a very large Philistine warrior, a giant of a man, emerges from their ranks and roars out a challenge: choose a man to come and fight. If I kill him, you'll be our servants. If he kills me, we'll be your servants. If I can get a contest here, the two armies are facing each other from opposite hillsides, a broad valley between. Apparently this has been going on every day for 40 days, and no Israelite soldier had the courage or the foolishness to take on the challenge. David is there as he watches and hears this and says, who does he think he is, challenging the army of Yahweh, the Lord? His brothers scold him, and then David returns to his part-time job as Saul's private musician and tells the king he'd like to fight Goliath. Well, the king discourages him and finally consents. After trying on Saul's armor and Saul's weapons and finding them so heavy he can't move, he takes it all off and arms himself with his own sling and picks up a few smooth stones and heads out to confront Goliath. And by the way, if you've been on a tour of the Holy Land, they always take you to that spot. And so I've been there, and yes, I stooped down and picked up a couple of stones that I still have somewhere. I don't carry them with me. Now, you know how this ends. Goliath laughs, dismisses David. David sprints right at him, takes a sling out and a stone and hits Goliath in the forehead, who falls down, and David finishes him off. David's career trajectory is straight up after that. He displays remarkable skill at military strategy and leadership and rises through the rank of the Israelite Army Corps. He not only defeated Goliath, he gets the king's daughter Michal as a reward. But now Saul begins to show a propensity to jealousy, beginning to see David as a threat. After returning from a successful military venture, Saul and David are welcomed by a group of young women dancing with tambourines and singing, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000s. And that stimulates Saul's jealousy into paranoia, which erupts when Saul, out of the blue, heaves his spear at David and misses. That occurs several times. Jealousy and paranoia turned violent. Saul tries to kill David and misses every time. I concluded that either Saul has really bad aim, or maybe he really didn't want to kill his future son-in-law. Anyhow, David now has the upper hand, has several opportunities to dispatch Saul and spares him every time. David now has accumulated a private army, 600 armed and loyal men. And when Israel and the Philistines go at it yet another time, because David's getting tired of Saul trying to kill him, David sits this one out. The Israelites are beaten. Saul's son Jonathan and his brothers, Saul's son Jonathan, who David loves and who loves David, is killed along with two brothers, and Saul takes his own life. Saul's son, Mephibosheth, thinks he inherits the crown, but Yahweh has a different idea. David will reign first over Judah, the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And Mephibosheth will reign over the rest of the tribes, and civil war erupts for several years. David finally prevails, is anointed king of a reunited nation, Israel, makes Jerusalem the capital city, and renames it for himself the city of David. David has shown himself to be brave, strong, a natural leader, and best of all, a friend of Yahweh. When he installs the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, there is great celebrating. He is adored by his people. Tributes pour in from other kings in the area. He has plenty of wives, concubines, and lots of children. In the middle of all that, he has a big heart. He stops and takes time to find Saul's last living relative, a grandson, Jonathan's son, who has a physical handicap, and David essentially adopts him. David is at the top of his game, at the very pinnacle of power, popularity, authority. He is truly blessed, and as we ended last week, how could anything possibly go wrong? Well, the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel begins with what I think is one of the most provocative statements in the Bible. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. What's that about? That's not like David, not at all. He's a warrior, a military man par excellence. Ordinarily, David can't wait for spring. So why does he not go out with his army? What's he doing at home while his men are ravaging the Ammonites? He doesn't have television to watch, or you can read only so many scrolls. Someone suggested that David is in the midst of a midlife crisis, when men, as we all know, are inclined to do crazy things. Verse 2 of the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel tells us what David is doing. And I quote, "It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. It's Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite, who was out in the field fighting with David's army." So that's what David was doing. He sends for her, they make love, she sends word back to him, "I'm pregnant." And now will emerge some of the most despicable behavior imaginable. Yahweh's friend will show himself capable of lying, plotting, and murder. He comes up with a scheme, simple, sensible. He sends word to his commanding general Joab to send Uriah home. David himself welcomes Uriah, inquires about the progress of the battle, gives Uriah the night off. Go home, have a lovely evening with your wife, Bathsheba. Uriah shows himself to be a man of great integrity and loyalty, does not go home to his wife, but instead sleeps outside on the ground outside the king's doorstep. David is surprised. Obviously, he's not happy. He asks Uriah, why in the world did he not go home? And the taller Uriah stands, the smaller David becomes. My lord Joab and his men are camping in the open field, Uriah says. Shall I then go to my home to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I would not do such a thing. David tries again. This time he plies Uriah with alcohol, but once again Uriah chooses to sleep on the king's doorstep instead of with Bathsheba. Now David is simply despicable. He writes a letter to Joab and has Uriah hand deliver it when he returns to the battlefield. He's actually delivering his own death warrant. David instructs Joab to put Uriah in the hardest, toughest fighting, pull all Uriah's comrades back, and essentially allow the Philistines to kill him. And that's what happens. There is a detail I hadn't noticed before. There was collateral damage, like the civilians and children who died when we bombed a car in Kabul that we thought contained terrorists, but which didn't. Unsuspecting soldiers also died when the main force withdrew to expose Uriah. There's a last despicable detail. When the messenger from Joab reports to David, mission accomplished, Uriah is dead, David tries to assure the messenger, do not let this matter trouble you. The sword devours now one and now another. Bathsheba mourns her husband's death, and when the mourning was over, David sent for her and married her, and a son is born. There must be some accounting. Chapter 12, verse 1, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Accounting comes in the person of Nathan, prophet, Yahweh's spokesperson. Yahweh sends Nathan to David to express displeasure. Nathan tells David a little story. Two men, one rich, one poor. Rich man has lots of cattle and sheep. The poor man has one small ewe lamb. The man and his family love that lamb. It is his children's favorite pet. They play with the lamb all day, even bring it inside to eat from the table. The lamb even sleeps beside the poor man. So the rich man had company he had to feed, and he really didn't want to slaughter one of his own lambs. So he does the unconscionable. He takes the poor man's pet lamb. David is indignant. He's angry, righteously angry. Any man that does such an outrageous thing deserves to die, he says. Make him repay the poor man fourfold. I envision a long, increasingly painful silence as truth and justice begin to emerge. Finally, Nathan, David, my Lord, you are the man. Nathan continues, speaking now on behalf of Yahweh. I anointed you king. I rescued you from Saul, gave you Saul's mansion, gave you wives, gave you both Judah and Israel. And in what you have done, you have despised me. So now you will have trouble, even in your own family. You're going to lose a lot. To David's credit, he does not make excuse or try to rationalize what he did. Instead, he expresses immediate remorse and confesses, I have sinned against the Lord. Notice that David does not say, I sinned only against Uriah, nobody else got hurt. Instead, he gives voice to an important Judeo-Christian concept of morality. Sin, injustice, cruelty toward other people is actually sin against God. Oppressing, discriminating against, marginalizing other people, no matter who they are, is an offense to God. Psalm 51, you might have noticed this, has a little note, a little introductory note, and it says, to the leader, a psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. We often read that psalm together at the beginning of Lent. Very familiar phrases, have mercy on me, O God. Wash me, cleanse me from my sin. Against you and you only have I sinned. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Nathan assures David that Yahweh has forgiven him, has put away your sin, and you will not die. But there will be consequences. The child born to Bathsheba will die, and that is what happens. But not before David goes through excruciating experience of standing helplessly by as your baby falls sick and slowly declines. David pleads with Yahweh. He stops eating altogether, sleeps on the bare ground rather than in his bed. It's the worst thing that can happen to a parent. His attendants beg David to eat something, to sleep in his own bed, and David refuses. Finally, the child dies. David rises from where he has been lying, washes, anoints himself, goes to the sanctuary to worship, and takes some food. Bathsheba becomes pregnant again and gives birth to another son. David names him Solomon. Solomon, who is destined for great things. But David's descent and troubles are actually just beginning. More fighting ensues. David orders the people, the Ammonites that are defeated this time, to be forced to work for Israel. The Israelites set them to work with saws and iron picks and axe, and send some to work in the brickworks. I guess I missed that detail before. Forced labor, reminiscent of how the Israelites themselves were treated by their Egyptian captors years before when they were in Egypt. What happens next is appalling. There are many sons and daughters from David and his many wives and concubines. It must have been a big and complicated family. Real trouble begins when one of David's sons, Amnon, becomes obsessed with his beautiful half-sister, Tamar. Amnon tries everything he can think of to get Tamar's attention. She's simply not interested, doesn't even notice him. And he's torturing himself with love and passion and desire. A cousin comes up and helps him devise a plan. He tells Amnon, pretend to be ill, stay in bed, pretending to be sick. When your father becomes concerned, ask him to send Tamar to care for you and bring some of the special cakes she bakes. So Tamar comes with her cakes, and she serves Amnon, and he grabs her arm and asks her to his bed. Tamar refuses, and when Amnon becomes more aggressive, she begs him to stop, but he's stronger. She struggles, but he rapes her. Afterward, Amnon is disgusted with her. Get out, he says. She begs. He calls his servant and orders him to take the woman away and bolt the door. Tamar is devastated, humiliated, removes the robe that identifies her as a virgin, puts ashes on her head, and went away crying aloud. Tamar has an older brother, Absalom. Absalom discovers what has happened, and he's enraged and arranges for Amnon to be killed, and then Amnon flees. So David's daughter has been raped by her half-brother. Her assailant has been killed by another half-brother who disappears, and it's not even over yet. Absalom has a special place in David's heart. He's a big, handsome son, very capable, a good soldier. David is very proud of him, loves him very much, and now he's gone. Joab finds Absalom, brings him home back to Jerusalem. After 2 years or so, David and Absalom reconcile. Absalom is cutting quite a figure in Jerusalem. He has a wife, 3 sons, and a daughter. The daughter is named after Absalom's sister, Tamar. All seems to be well finally with David. But actually, Absalom has been very busy betraying his father, undercutting his authority. He recruits and arms followers and actually pulls off a brief palace coup and has himself crowned as king. He's popular throughout Israel, and when he heads toward Jerusalem, David has to flee. And we find David climbing up the Mount of Olives, weeping, his head covered, walking barefoot. It's a scene of great pathos, betrayed by your own beloved son. Absalom, meanwhile, is enjoying the concubines David left behind when he fled Jerusalem. It's a profound tragedy, betrayed by your son who has essentially banished you and replaced you. I have 3 sons, and I can feel David's deep pain, and it's about to get even worse. David recovers and gathers loyal soldiers, and it turns out that there's a lot of them, and there's going to be a showdown. Joab, David's loyal commander, is there again at the head of the army. Absalom, the illegitimate king of Israel, has his own army. There will be a battle to the finish. David wants to lead his troops, but he's persuaded to remain behind. So David asks Joab, "Deal gently with my son Absalom." The battle commences. David's forces overwhelm Absalom's army. Meanwhile, Absalom is riding on his mule, I think, trying to escape, when he becomes entangled and caught in a tree. He's hanging there helpless. Joab is told about it and makes a very difficult but important decision. Loyal Joab takes responsibility and kills Absalom. Runners are dispatched to report the victory to the king. His monarchy has been saved. He's been saved. He's still king. He questions the runners about his son, Absalom. Is he safe? Is he alive? And he receives the appalling truth. Absalom is dead. 2 Samuel 18:33. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son?" I don't know of a more powerful cry than David's. I can't imagine pain more painful. William Faulkner, by the way, wrote a novel about three families in the South before, during, and after the Civil War under the title Absalom, Absalom. David's men hear about David's grief. David is now almost out of control. He's weeping publicly and crying over and over again, "Oh, Absalom, Absalom." People hear it. The soldiers hear it, and their own joy and pride over the victory turns sour. Instead of a festive celebration, they steal into the city ashamed of themselves. Good old Joab, though, is furious and confronts David. "These men saved your life and the lives of all your family and followers, and all you can do is weep over your treacherous son who caused all this tragedy. I suppose you'd be happy if your son were alive and we were all dead. Pull yourself together, David. Address your troops. Be a king again. Be our king." Well, there's more battles, there's more victories. David pauses to compose and deliver a beautiful song of thanksgiving, and the end looms. David speaks his final words. In the next book in the Bible, 1 Kings, chapter 1 and 2, David dies and is succeeded by Bathsheba's son, Solomon. And that's the end of my story. So there are a lot of pieces on the floor, Professor. Maybe you could pick them all up for us.
I only wish. Oh, thanks, John. Thank you. That was yeoman's work.
Go to it.
Okay, it is our last week of the David cycle. 3 weeks we've looked at the David cycle. The very first thing that I remember saying in this series is, if we're going to read the David cycle, then the starting point is to realize that the narrative contains the message, right? It's not just interesting or offensive stories. What is the author trying to tell us that makes this story scripture? Which means that it is always current, or it wouldn't be in Bible. It's not there because it was interesting and important tradition. Most of it's gone. So why this? Why shaped the way it is, and what are we supposed to do with it? I want to start at the end of my handout. It is a handout that lost control. And the reason it is a handout that lost control is that I've really struggled with this material this week. I'm pretty clear on the first part of the David cycle, and that's usually where I end teaching intro, because there's only so much time in an intro class at a seminary. So moving into this story of David post the unconditional promise to David, which is a whole lot of literature, not a couple of verses. It's the better part of an entire book. And actually, we could have taken this through 1 Kings 11. That is, Solomon's locked into the same problem. It's the Davidic Solomonic rule that's being looked at here. But what I want you to see, if you go to the last page of my handout, is that we don't need any of this story in the Bible. There are 2 versions of the story of David in the Bible. There's the one we're studying, the former prophets, but there's just as complicated and big of a history of David in the book of Chronicles, which spends more time on David, not less. Comparing those 2 shows us that these stories are constructed with an author's point of view in mind. And let me illustrate that a minute. All of the early story about David living in the old world, in the conditional covenant, the charismatic view of religion in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, the author in Chronicles doesn't give 2 hoots about it. It's not there. The conflicts between David and Saul and the charismatic power of David to be able to exorcise the evil side of Yahweh out of Saul. The author of Chronicles doesn't care about it. Not there. The early rule of David when he's still living in the conditional covenant world of rewards and punishments in 2 Samuel 1-4. Not there in Chronicles. Author doesn't care about it. Not a concern to the author. So do you see how there's points of view in the writing of Bible? This isn't neutral literature. Somebody's not dictating something. They're constructing something. David rules all of Israel and Jerusalem. Finally, our author kicks in. That's what the chronicler wants to talk about. The enthronement of David in Jerusalem, and no messy business. The mighty men of David, the chronicler doesn't care about that. The bringing of the ark to Jerusalem, both writers care about that. The dynastic promise of unconditional covenant, they're both locked into that. That's non-negotiable in the history of ancient Israel. David secures his kingdom. They both care a lot about that. Now, our class today. The messy life of David when he gets an unconditional promise of salvation. The author in Chronicles doesn't want to talk about that. No. None of it is there. All the conflict in the house of David, none of it is there. So when I look at these 2, and frankly, we could have had the Chronicles in the former prophets, and you wouldn't know any of this. Almost all the content of our course wouldn't exist. So you see, so when we say the narrative carries the theology, you better believe it does. So our question in the last 3 weeks is on that version that includes all of this. And then we want to know why. What do we take from that? And one of the things that John and I have been reflecting on is radical change in religion. And how what works at one period of time doesn't work at another. And what do you do as a religious community when change invades your life? The ark should have defeated the Philistines. Instead, they capture it as a trinket. That tension is built into now one character in the former prophets, David. David embodies all of this ambiguity. He is an ideal character in the old world. As a boy, He doesn't stumble once. There's no negative story about David in those early chapters as a youth. And because it isn't, he's successful. It's a conditional world. He is faithful and he is rewarded. Saul stumbles and the deity deserts him. That's the old world religion. That's a rewards and punishment form of religion. You can't bet the farm on God. You better look at what you're doing first. Now that's a powerful form of religion, and it's also enormously insecure. Because I'm pretty bad most of the time. I'd have been with Saul. And a lot of what Saul did, he stumbled for religious reasons. He just got his theology wrong. Don't matter to the deity. Intentions don't matter. You see how insecure yet powerful that world is? So last week we flip around and David is still fulfilling that world. He's a successful holy warrior. And holy war collectively represents conditional religion. Don't think narrowly about just fighting battles. It's a worldview. It's all or nothing. That's conditional. And if it's not all on your part, then God is free. God can leave you. God is only responsible to us when we are faithful to God. But God is not responsible to us when we're not. Ask Saul. Ask Saul. Right? Now, our writer wants us to see that. So then, last week, it's kind of a funny little story. There is a world order change from the rural to the urban. And David has a city, and he's now a monarch, and he's built himself a really good palace. We've left the world of the tribes. We've left the Bronze Age, and we've entered the Iron Age. And in that change, David says, oh, I feel so bad that I live better than God. Right? And you can read that cynically, or you can read that piously. I don't think our author cares how you read it. It's just true. And in that story, Nathan, who's an old world character, says, I like your piety. Whatever you're thinking, do it. That is, you're on the rewards and punishment side. Gets out the door and the deity clobbers him. Okay, that God has morphed. That God who clobbered Nathan in the back of the head is not quite the same functioning deity that we've been reading about. So we're in a time of radical change. And the deity comes back and says, I'm changing the rules of the game. I am overpowering conditional religion, and I'm giving up freedom myself so that you can be secure in the notion that you can't do anything that would get me out of your story, ever. The rules of Saul are gone. There is nothing you can do whereby you would force me to leave you. That's unconditional religion. That is election. What did you do to get saved? Nothing. What can you do to get out of it? Nothing. Do you see how radical that is? Okay. Now, our author wants us to read the life of David in this new world order. Well, what's that really like? What would that be like? Well, I'm feeling pretty upbeat after last week. I'm thinking, whoa, that's me and God can't get away, and I'm feeling good. This should be enormously optimistic. And we get a tragic story of one train wreck of sex and politics after another. It's just the ugliest literature in the Bible. Now, why is this author giving us this ugly, ugly sex and politics literature? What are we supposed to do with that? How do we appropriate that? John nailed it when he said the opening word kicks off the problem. The problem with unconditional election is that you're feeling pretty good about yourself. Once saved, always saved? Yeah. Oh, it's spring of the year. I probably, as a king, ought to be involved in risking my life for the nation, but I don't feel like it this spring. And what would the deity do about it anyhow? You see, our author has started us on the path of this new world, exciting, unbelievably dynamic religious world where you can't escape the deity. Or put it the other way, the deity can't get away from you. There is no place in this world where you can go so far that the deity isn't somehow in the rough of the experience of it. That's what our authors, that's why these stories are so ugly. Saul didn't do anything like this. This makes Saul look pretty darn good. I've thought of that for a lot of politics I haven't liked in history after the last 4 years. Think, he wasn't that bad. Wasn't that bad. Well, that's Saul when you start reading the David story after he enters this new world order. The guy's abysmal. And the deity can't leave the story. And the worst, there's two related events. They really aren't separate events. They're a sequence of the same thing. There's a repetition between sex and politics. There's the first account, David not going to holy war. That is, he's arrogant in his power and election. And that then leads to the next thing. He's bored and wants to have an affair with a woman across the street who he sees bathing. And does. He's the king, after all. And then the holy war is going on where he should have been. Right? And the husband's a Hittite. He's not even kosher. There are so many layers to this story. He should be out. If this happened before 2 Samuel 7, we'd be long gone. We'd be looking for another king. It'd be the conditional world of religion. But God can't leave this story. God's stuck with a mess. It's kind of sewage. That then becomes more internalized with a family rape. And now, I don't know, you have to study this on your own. But it seems to me the author, through David, tries to begin to negotiate in baby steps this new world order where it isn't just justice. That's holy war. It's all or nothing. It's the justice world. Because what happens in unconditional religion is the possibility of forgiveness that does not fit justice. These are very difficult concepts religiously. I've been on the justice side quite a bit lately. But the really hard one is forgiveness. When justice demands something else and everyone knows it, and our author begins to play with David. He's despicable, he's unjust, he's a murderer. All right? And then he has an interfamily rape. and he won't do anything about it. He knew, the author says, but it was his firstborn son. It's so ugly. It was ugly when it was written. Our author wants it to be ugly. And Absalom, the brother of Tamar, seeks justice. I'm on his side, and he kills him. You know, I'm reading that, I'm thinking, phew, thought he was going to get away with it. Huh? Okay, that's old world order. That's a justice world. Well, there's justice in this new world too, but it's not the absolute. So now our author comes back and begins to probe rudimentary forgiveness in our flawed character. Because at the heart of holy war is a concept called blood guilt. You shed blood, then I want your blood. That's conditional religion. You shed blood, I want your blood. And Absalom sheds blood, and David balks. We're not in this my firstborn son anymore. He's struggling, I think, in a very flawed way. Right? These are the first steps in the New World Order, and he's probing, breaking the rule of blood guilt. And we get a whole story where the wise woman of Tekoa comes to him and says, you know, you ought to think about breaking blood guilt. Forgive. Just forgive. Well, that is so radical, friends. I'm very uncomfortable with it. I kind of want Absalom to get it. But David he's not heroic. He's flawed. And John brought this out so well. Because he becomes obsessed with his son. To the point where it becomes selfish. And a lot of people are risking their lives for him in a holy war event, and he can't get out of his own head. And the writer at one point says, and David turned holy war into shame. The first attempt at forgiveness in my reading of this story is a train wreck. That is, if you enter a world where it's possible to just forgive, it's not a blanket check. You bear responsibility. Now you're justice, forgiveness, justice, forgiveness. And David's not very good at it. But he is the first person who even has the option in Hebrew Bible. So he's paradigmatic. He's very important. A lot of people read the crucifixion as Jesus ending blood guilt. It's an old Christian reading. Stop justice. Forgiveness. That would be the Davidic side of this. Let me go a little bit further with this. So now, it seems to me, in the telling of this story, the way I would read these typologies of David is little exercises in how do you live in this new world order, when in fact you don't have a clue of how to live in this new world order. And the only thing that makes these stories keep going is that God can't leave the story. So God's constantly pulling these stories to the next really bad example of living in this world. And through the early stories, other people have to represent the deity to David. Prophets come and talk to David. The wise women of Tekoa comes and talks to David. That is, they're mediating. That's the old world order. That's how it all works. But as these stories progress, watch David. He acquires speech. He begins to address the deity directly. That is, he begins to understand this new world order. There's no place I can go where I can't talk to God. And God's got to listen to me. If you take my little handout, where do I have an example of that? Where does that be? Take on page 3. David finally addresses the deity directly on point D. David said, "Oh Yahweh, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." David has not talked to the deity up to this point. Kings don't talk to the deity up to this point. Intermediaries represent the deity. In this new world order where the deity can't escape the world, what our writer is saying is, you have access now to the deity. And it doesn't matter how despicable you are. The deity can't leave your story. And David slowly acquires this, and he becomes a talker to God. That is, he begins to construct the world of prayer. I pray you, O Lord. Now, I think that's pretty important to the author. Unconditional covenant isn't a heroic story. It is a new insight into God's limitations. God can't leave your experience. And they give you the worst examples in David. Don't ever think you can leave the world of God in this new world order, because you can't. You don't believe me? Go read about David. When's the last time you had an affair and killed the husband? Yeah. That takes some ingenuity. You got to really wanna. So we're at the extremes of experience. How this is developed in Scripture is that David begins to become the mouthpiece of a new power in religion when whether you experience it or not, you know conceptually that God can't abandon you. You may feel like God has abandoned you, but post 2 Samuel 7, unconditional promise, it doesn't matter how you feel about God. The old world of religion cared a lot about how you felt about God. You had to be filled with the Spirit, and that would jump. The New World Order says, well, that's nice when that happens, and you ought to enjoy it, but it's not the end-all and be-all of the religious life. You cannot have had an experience of God in the last 2 years, and you can talk to God if you want, because God can't not answer you. That's unconditional religion. So David, as he acquires voice, you'll notice that his story ends with a long prayer. And I think it's 2 Samuel 22, John, I forget. But what I want you to see is that's just not arbitrary. What happens interbiblically, and this is a very late development in canon, the Psalms, which are the language of... Biblical writers don't like creative praying. Oh, Jesus, I just want to say to you right now, I was thinking about... No! Don't talk to God that way. They give you a book that has every prayer you'll ever need. We call that the Psalter. They don't wing it. You're talking to the deity. Here's the Psalter. The late development of the Psalter, and this is late, we call this midrashic. The late development of the Psalter takes our stories of David, and if you go to page 5 on my handout, they take these psalms, which were not written to be said by David. They're just written liturgies used in worship. And they pull them back into the story we've been studying. And what they're saying is, if you are like that, or if you are in an experience like this, say this prayer. If you have an affair and kill the husband, all right? It can't get much worse than that, can it? Then our writers say, read Psalm 51. If you look at my little handout, To the choir master, Psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. What are those Psalter? What are they saying? They're saying they're filling out the reality of unconditional covenant. If you had an affair and killed the husband, God has not left your story. Wow. That's unconditional religion. And so, read, and I gave you Psalm 51, and Psalm 51, it's just, it's the dregs. Have mercy on me, O God, according to what? Not justice, steadfast love. You see? So how do you balance this in this? This is us. This is the religious life. When is it justice? When is it unconditional forgiveness? Notice, David doesn't get an unconditional covenant and it's just one good story after another. It's not a gospel of wealth story. The guy's a train wreck. But you've got to negotiate forgiveness, justice. And so, Ash Wednesday, we put ourselves on the edge of our existence in this world order, whatever your horrible thing is. And we read Psalm 51 on Ash Wednesday. Create in me a clean heart, O God. That psalmist isn't saying, oh, be just with me, O God. Give me the medicine. I need the medicine. That all becomes the language of David, the sorting out. And look at how many Psalms now. David is the speaker of the Psalms. And what these authors are saying is, here it is. If you have a problem, don't just waffle around, flop like a fish on the beach. Read the story of David. Go to the Psalter. Pick the one you need. It'll work. Which I find enormously powerful. Could say more, but David becomes terribly important. Now it's hard, come on up with me, John. It's hard to apply this to Jesus in the New Testament. This is where Christianity gets in trouble. Because Jesus takes the Davidic tradition and then makes it perfect. There's another agenda in the New Testament. In many ways, reading the Hebrew Bible version of David, better for us. It's a story about us. So, any hoot. John.
Wow.
Yeah.
Powerful literature, isn't it? Very powerful.
We've got 10 more minutes. The Bears on TV, but they were so loud. They realized we didn't very home this time. Who wants to respond in any way, ask a question, push back, please?
I'll try. So
Belt it out now so everybody can hear it.
okay, so this was very beautiful in many ways because the way I experience it, it's like moving from justice or we punishing others to healing. You know, Jesus was a healer. And it reminds me, John, you remember Hardy Kemp that was here, a minister, and he once told those of us who went to his speech about a minister, and where was Hardy from? Which Asian country? Korea.
South
Yeah.
Korea.
So he told a story of, I think it was Reverend Moon in Korea. And Reverend Moon's son was murdered by his friend, like they were teenagers. And the other teenager murdered Reverend Moon's son. And what did Reverend Moon do? He adopted the boy. Ooh, I could cry. They killed his son. And I think that's what the story is really about. It's a movement of ever-expanding goodness in learning. And Christ showed us that, right? And I'll tell one more story, which is I had many years ago the opportunity to work with a man who is Jewish. And when he was a little boy, his whole family was annihilated in Nuremberg by the Germans, they came in, they raped the daughter, I took private on this, because I know the person, raped the daughter, raped the mother. And then they shot him. And this little boy, they had dug a tunnel under the crystal shop in Nuremberg, and they used to practice. They knew, you know, when the Nazis were coming, it was going to be soon, it was going to be soon. So they trained the kids to go down there, and you got there outside, you know, in the yard, and you'd come under the building. And so the only survivor, this man, as I knew him then, he in silence heard his sister being raped, the mother being raped, and then everybody was shot, and blood coming down through somehow, like to the floor to him. And he wrote a book, and I wish I knew if he ever published it or not. With the story, I cried all the way home. I was on a flight from California reading it at night, and the name of the book was Healing, Forgiving Nuremberg. And it was like forgiving the Germans, I mean the Nazis, I should say. I don't know what I should say. But, and he was afraid to publish it, that's what he told me, because he was afraid that all of his Jewish friends would never understand it and would be totally disgusted with it. So that's what all of this reminded me of.
Thank you for that. There's an example in our midst of Jean Bishop. Many of you know her, and Jean's got this terrible story to tell, but it's a story ultimately of reconciliation and forgiveness. And it's interesting, I have the great privilege of teaming up with Jean once a year at Loyola. Continuing Education Department does a long conference on forgiveness and walking on the title, restorative justice. And one time we had jail chaplains, Catholic jail chaplains from all over the country, and this past year we had nuns from all over the world, from some of the worst spots in South America where there's persecution and killing. Jean tells a story, and I try to fill in and stumble around with the theology of forgiveness in the Old Testament. But it's a fascinating thing. Jean forgave her sister, brother-in-law's killer, and it started a relationship. Fellows in jail, but Jean and he became corresponding friends and personal friends. Anybody else want to say something? Please, Jane.
I need some help here. You can commit murder, and all you have to do to be forgiven is go and ask for forgiveness and read the Psalter. You can't run a society on this kind of so.
No. I don't think our author thinks so either. David's great sin in the Absalom revolt was that he didn't kill him. Justice. And by overemphasizing forgiveness through the emotions of being his father, he shamed his troops. He shamed the country. So I don't think our author thinks that either. These are really hard stories. It isn't one against the other. It's sorting it all out. But I think on a cosmological, on a religious level, the only reason you can even talk about forgiveness is that the deity's in the story. Humans doing it, I mean, it's probably got a political motive anyhow. But that the deity doesn't leave this story. That's why they're even thinking about it. You don't forgive in the world of holy war, you seek justice. And this creates, these are great stories teaching ethics.
It's not a plan for how to run anything. Obviously you can't, someone's got to stop what the Nazis were about in the 30s and the 40s, and justice was done. They were stopped, a lot of people died. We can't, forgiveness is another thing altogether. We believe in a God of unconditional love, And I love the way Tom puts it, you can't get away. My favorite song, 139, I can go to the ends of the earth, and I'll still be there holding you in my right hand. That doesn't say you can go murder people. You understand, you can be accountable for that in any kind of human society. But this is not a plan how to run the police department. Restorative justice, by the way, is kind of an interesting concept. I mean, it starts on the premise that what we're doing now stinks. It doesn't work. It costs a lot of money, and it doesn't cure anything in our society. So maybe instead of putting people in prison and throwing away the key, maybe we ought to at least think about how to restore a right relationship with society with this person.
The literature that I have a much harder time with the New Testament than with the Davidic material, because the Davidic material allows for a balancing, a discernment of justice, forgiveness. The New Testament's radically on the forgiveness side. Jesus is a pacifist. He declares holy war by sacrificing himself to stop blood guilt. Well, I'm not sure I'm on board there. You see, the New Testament is far more radical. It almost seems utopian to me.
So on the way back.
Yeah, this is a very important story. How would you unpack this for young people? They know David and Goliath. They don't know the rest of David.
Yeah, well, you got to get into sex and politics at a younger age then. But I don't mean to throw that off, but negotiating forgiveness and justice, not against each other, but a both and then having to discern, that's the Christian life, isn't it? I mean, so you can't begin too young.
This is probably the topic of another 3-year course, but in just a couple sentences, could you say what the purpose of the narrator in Chronicles, what that narrator was trying to show?
Yes. That writer, it's much later, well, this is probably exilic literature, 6th century, 5th century, gets it re-edited. The chronicler's probably 3rd century, 4th century, moving into the Hellenistic era. And that writer wants to affirm the power of the Davidic. My hunch is that that might be tied with the rise of Maccabees, which is a reaffirmation of Davidic rule in the ancient world. I've acquired a deep love for the chronicler. I was never taught it. Protestants always moved to the former prophets, but boy, the more I get into the chronicler, it's very, it's got its own issues. It's got its own issues, but it isn't about change. It's about establishment. David represents an establishment. And there is no conflict. It's divine will, which tells me they don't have it. Right? It's probably utopian. Mm-hmm.
We're at the hour, folks. Tom and I will hang out here.